Juan, a documentary filmmaker, was in the mountains filming local wildlife when he heard a sound that didn't belong in the environment. A low, restrained growl coming from somewhere above him, different from the normal noises of the forest. He raised the camera toward the sound, and it took him a few seconds to understand what he was seeing. Up there, hanging from the edge of a steep cliff, was a pregnant female jaguar. Her swollen belly made any safe movement impossible, and the animal could neither climb up nor descend, trapped in that impossible position with a fatal drop waiting directly below. Juan filmed from a distance for a few moments and immediately tried to call the forest rangers, but there was no signal at that point in the mountains. He looked at his phone and made the decision without much drama, beginning to climb the steep slope toward the cliff, grabbing onto roots and rocks while the weight of the backpack and camera pressed against his back. When he reached the top and saw the jaguar up close, the situation was even worse than it had looked from afar. The animal was exhausted from trying to move, and the unborn cubs in her belly made coordinated movement impossible. Juan crouched down and tried the most direct thing any human would attempt. He tried pulling the animal upward by the neck and front leg, straining with all his strength. It didn't work. The jaguar was too heavy, the angle was terrible, and she had no way to help with the rescue because her hind legs couldn't find support to push upward. Juan stopped, took a deep breath, and looked at his backpack. He had brought a rope for the expedition that day, the kind of thing an experienced documentarian carries almost out of habit. And at that moment, that rope became the center of the plan. He tied one end to a sturdy tree trunk near the cliff with a knot that wouldn't give way easily. Then he opened the backpack, pulled out his lunchbox, and removed a chicken breast he had packed for lunch, rubbing the meat all over the other end of the rope until the smell became strong. After that, he carefully climbed down to where the jaguar was hanging and brought the scented end close to the animal's muzzle. The jaguar sniffed it, hesitated for a second, and then bit the rope hard. Juan began pulling from above, slowly, causing the animal's weight to rise inch by inch along the cliff face. The jaguar kept biting without letting go, instinctively clinging to it, and her paws began finding tiny ledges in the rock to push herself upward. But the edge of the cliff was crumbling. With every pull from Juan, small stones broke loose from the rim and tumbled into the abyss below. And for a moment it seemed like the entire edge was going to collapse and take the jaguar with it. Juan didn't stop. He did the opposite. He pulled even harder with both arms, leaning his entire body backward with all his weight. The stones kept breaking, the gravel kept sliding, and then, in one final effort, the jaguar managed to throw her front paws over the edge, distributing enough weight for Juan to drag the rest of her body up. The animal cleared the cliff and slid across the flat rock, collapsing on her side with a dull thud. Juan collapsed beside her, sitting heavily with trembling arms and a heaving chest. The two remained there for a long moment. The jaguar lay on her side, belly moving rapidly. Juan sat nearby staring at the horizon while trying to catch his breath. Neither of them was capable of doing anything else in that moment, and for now they didn't need to. Juan was still trying to steady his breathing when the jaguar moved. The animal remained motionless for a few seconds. Then she began bending her legs, pushing herself upright and rising slowly, swaying slightly before finding her balance. Then she turned her head and looked directly at Juan, who was sitting less than 2 meters away with nothing between them. He didn't move. He knew any sudden motion would be a mistake, so he stayed still, heart racing but body frozen. His eyes locked on the animal's eyes. Juan had been through situations like this before. He had helped other jaguars over the years, and he never truly knew what would come after that stare. Could mean anything. The jaguar stared for several seconds that felt much longer than they really were. Then she turned and walked toward the jungle, disappearing among the trees without hurry and without looking back. Juan released the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. When he went to grab his backpack and camera, he noticed the camera was still on and the recording indicator had been running since before he reached the cliff. He had pressed the record button at the start of the climb, when he first heard the growl, and he had never turned it off. The entire rescue had been recorded. He slung the camera strap around his neck, watched the footage for a few seconds on the tiny screen, then closed the monitor. It wasn't time to review the footage. He still had work to do that day. He shot a few more scenes from above, capturing the mountains and dense jungle below, then began descending toward the place where he had been working earlier. Halfway down, the smell arrived before the thought did. A strong scent of chicken rising from his own hand, the residue left from rubbing the meat on the rope to save the Jaguar. He looked at his palm and instantly recognized the problem. He headed to a nearby stream to wash up, running his fingers through the cold water while the smell slowly faded. His hands were still in the water when the rustling began. Movement in the vegetation beside the stream, low and deliberate, different from the sound of wind in leaves. Juan slowly raised his eyes without making sudden movements and saw the vegetation part less than 10 meters away. The puma was large and fully grown, already in an attack posture when Juan spotted it. Its body was low, ears pinned back, eyes fixed on him. The animal had followed the scent of chicken through the jungle and arrived there. And now the distance between them was too short for any intelligent reaction. Juan began backing away slowly, one step at a time, maintaining eye contact with the animal, doing exactly what people are taught to do in situations like that. But his foot caught a root he hadn't seen, and the ground vanished beneath him. He fell hard onto his back. The puma lunged in the same instant, crossing the distance between them in a fraction of a second. Its jaws clamped down on Juan's leg with a force he hadn't expected, even knowing what was happening. He screamed and tried to pull free. He screamed again for help in a useless reflex in the middle of the jungle, while the animal shook its head violently, keeping its bite locked as its weight pinned Juan to the ground. And then came the roar, loud and close, exploding from the vegetation to the right. The Jaguar burst from the undergrowth at full speed and slammed directly into the puma with her entire body. The impact sent Juan rolling sideways as the jaws released his leg. The fight was immediate and brutal. Claws, teeth, and sheer weight colliding violently until the puma finally tore free and disappeared into the jungle. Juan lay on the ground staring at the Jaguar who had saved his life mere minutes after he had saved hers. This time, the Jaguar didn't leave. She stood still for several seconds after the puma vanished into the brush, chest heaving from the fight. Then she started walking, but too slowly. There was an unevenness in her stride that Juan noticed immediately. He struggled to his feet, putting his weight on his good leg, and watched her carefully. She walked a few meters and stopped. Then she slowly lowered herself as if intentionally lying down and collapsed onto her side with a deep, painful groan Juan felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. He knew instantly that something was wrong. He approached carefully, step by step, until he could see the problem. The wound was in the abdomen, open and bleeding steadily in a way that left no doubt about its severity. The puma had struck with its claws before Juan had fully seen the attack, and the cut had hit a terrible place on the pregnant female Jaguar. He knelt there for a moment, face tense, calculating what he had and what needed to be done. The backpack was opened quickly, his hands already moving before he finished thinking. Juan had brought towels for the expedition that day, the kind of item that sits in a bag for years without ever becoming useful. But now every single one mattered. He tied them together into a long strip while the Jaguar breathed heavily beside him. With trembling hands he couldn't control, he wrapped the towel strip tightly around the animal's abdomen, covering the wound and applying firm pressure to slow the bleeding. The Jaguar growled softly when he tightened it. A warning. But she didn't react beyond that, almost as if she somehow understood what he was trying to do. He secured the knot with his teeth, pulling hard until he felt it wouldn't come loose. He stared at the makeshift bandage for several seconds, evaluating whether it would hold. Then he pulled out his phone. No signal. He already knew that. He had tried before, but this time the lack of signal felt different. Because now there was a wounded pregnant Jaguar lying beside him with cubs inside her, and the jungle stretched endlessly in every direction. He began walking. There was no sensible option except searching for signal. So he moved through the jungle, checking the screen every few steps, weaving around roots and low branches without taking his eyes off the indicator that stubbornly remained at 0. He climbed onto a fallen tree trunk crossing the path, raised his arm toward the sky as if 1 extra meter might matter. Waited. Nothing. He continued onward. Then he tried another direction, climbing to higher ground to see whether elevation would help. He stood there in the middle of the jungle with his arms stretched upward, chest rising and falling rapidly, phone pointed toward tiny fragments of sky between the treetops. 0 bars. The jungle was too dense. The mountains blocked the signal in every direction that mattered. Juan lowered his arm and stared at the screen for a few silent seconds. The Jaguar was alone back there with a towel wrapped around her belly and unborn cubs inside her. And the only path that made sense had nothing to do with finding a signal. He pocketed the phone with a firm movement and turned around. There was no time to waste on what didn't work. There was a wildlife veterinary sanctuary in Bolivia that he knew, a facility deep in the jungle dedicated to treating wild animals. And the route there crossed an entire mountain range with no marked trail. It was far. It was difficult. And it was the only real option left. Juan returned to the Jaguar, knelt beside her, and gently passed his hand over the animal's muzzle like someone making a decision that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The Jaguar breathed heavily, her side rising and falling unevenly, eyes half open and unfocused. Juan stayed kneeling there for a few seconds, calculating the weight, the positioning, the impossible logic of what he was about to attempt. More than 60 kilograms of wounded pregnant feline, and he was going to carry her over a mountain with no trail. He prepared carefully, adjusting the backpack straps and positioning the animal in the most advantageous way he could imagine. He crouched, slid his arms beneath her body, and lifted. The Jaguar shifted slightly before he managed to settle her weight over his shoulders and backpack, but eventually she stabilized. Before taking the first step, he reached out and pressed the record button on the camera. If there was one thing Juan Valdez knew how to do besides getting himself into absurd situations in the jungle, it was documenting those situations while they happened. The camera began recording, and he took the first step toward the mountain. The path offered no mercy. Dense vegetation closed around him from the beginning, branches crossing at face height and roots protruding from the ground every few feet. And the weight on his back turned every obstacle into something that had to be carefully calculated before confronting it. Juan used his free hands wherever he could, grabbing roots here, rocks there, forcing his body upward inch by inch. At one point his foot slipped on a moss-covered stone and his entire body lurched sideways. His knee slammed into the ground while instinct alone kept the Jaguar balanced on his shoulders. He remained frozen there for several seconds, knee burning, weight crushing his shoulders, breathing deeply before standing again and continuing. Higher up, a thick branch blocked the path at chest level and there was no way around it carrying that much weight. He slowly lowered his body, feeling every muscle protest. He crawled beneath the branch and stood again on the other side, releasing a strained sound halfway between exertion and a curse. The camera recorded everything. The jungle gave no relief, but neither did he. Juan had a particular way of walking when carrying weight through difficult terrain, a mechanical rhythm where he stopped thinking about the entire journey and focused only on the next foothold, the next route, the next rock. It was something learned after years inside jungles that were never designed to be crossed in a hurry. The Jaguar remained mostly still during the climb, heavy and passive on his shoulders, with only the occasional movement of her flank confirming she was still breathing. Sometimes Juan tilted his head slightly just to check. And simply feeling the warmth of the animal's body against his own was enough reason to continue. The incline grew steeper as they climbed. Loose rocks mixed with wet soil and tangled roots. Juan slowed his pace even further, testing every foothold before shifting weight onto it, moving like someone who understood that a fall there would not only be his own. The silence around them was complete except for his breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Then the terrain opened. The trees became smaller and more scattered until suddenly Juan reached the summit with wind striking his face and the horizon opening in all directions at once. He stood there for a few seconds with the Jaguar still on his back, staring across the mountains. And then his legs simply gave out. He collapsed sideways while the Jaguar slid off in the opposite direction. Both of them lay there motionless beside each other, staring at the sky while their chests rose and fell and the wind passed over them without urgency. Juan remained flat on his back for a long time with his arms spread beside him and his eyes shut against the brightness of the sky. He took several deep breaths and finally turned his head. The Jaguar was conscious, weak, her sides still moving in an uneven rhythm. He stared at her for several seconds and realized she wouldn't survive the rest of the journey without recovering at least some strength first. He pulled over the backpack and opened the main compartment. Inside was the lunchbox he had packed that morning before entering the forest, with what little food remained after using the chicken to save the Jaguar on the cliff. He opened the container and placed it near the animal's muzzle. The female Jaguar sniffed without moving for several seconds while Juan remained absolutely still. Then she stretched her neck forward and began eating slowly, pausing between bites. But she ate. Juan sat beside her in silence, elbows resting on his knees, simply watching. When she finished, she remained motionless for a moment. Then she bent her legs and pushed herself upright. She stood on her own, swaying slightly before finding balance. Juan watched silently, and simply seeing the animal standing again after everything they had survived in the past hours was enough for him to stand too. The descent down the opposite side of the mountain was less steep than the climb, but the terrain remained rough and demanded attention at every step. Juan walked ahead, clearing the way through the vegetation while the Jaguar followed several meters behind. He monitored her pace through the sound of dry leaves moving behind him, always checking whether she was still able to keep up. During the journey they came upon a tree heavy with bright red apples growing in the middle of the vegetation. Juan stopped before even consciously realizing why. His stomach had reacted before his mind did. He hadn't eaten since early morning and had given all his food to the Jaguar on the summit. He picked several apples from the lower branches and ate them right there standing up, chewing slowly for the first time in hours. The Jaguar remained beside him. Both rested there for several minutes, one eating, the other sniffing the air. Then they continued together. The river appeared once the forest began thinning slightly. Juan heard the water before he saw it. It was too wide to jump and too deep to cross on foot, meaning there was only one way through. He carefully placed the camera inside the backpack, zipped it shut, took a deep breath, and stepped into the water. The Jaguar entered immediately behind him without hesitation. That surprised Juan, because injured animals normally avoid water. But she entered and swam with an efficiency he hadn't expected, reaching the opposite shore before Juan had even crossed halfway. He had just begun allowing himself a moment of relief when he saw movement in the water. First on the left, then another on the right, came ants. The blood from the Jaguar's wound had spread through the current and attracted them. Now they approached with that slow, steady speed more terrifying than anything charging quickly. One caiman's jaws snapped shut in the air only inches from Juan's heel as he threw himself onto the muddy bank, panting while watching the reptiles drift back into the water as if nothing had happened. Juan remained seated on the riverbank for several minutes with soaked clothes clinging to his body and the puma bite in his leg throbbing harder after the swim. The Jaguar stood several meters ahead watching him with the calm attentiveness she had developed throughout the journey, almost as if waiting for him. He rose slowly, shook water from his hands and kept walking. The sanctuary appeared when the vegetation finally gave way to a more open area, wooden and wire fences emerging among the trees, and the distinct smell of a place shaped by human structure in the middle of the wilderness. Juan saw the faded sign at the entrance, worn down by rain and time but still readable, and felt something loosen in his chest for the first time in hours. Two veterinarians were standing outside when Juan emerged from the jungle with the Jaguar walking beside him. Both froze instantly. Whatever they had been doing stopped in midair as they stared at the scene without fully processing what they were seeing. A soaked, filthy man walking out of the forest beside a pregnant female Jaguar, as though they had traveled together intentionally. Juan raised a hand before anyone made any sudden movements and began loudly explaining the situation from a distance. The wound, the towel bandage, the pregnancy, the urgency. The veterinarians exchanged a quick glance and then snapped into action with the speed of people who know exactly what to do once surprise wears off. One prepared a sedative syringe while the other approached the Jaguar with measured movements, speaking softly the entire time like someone familiar with the protocol. The Jaguar allowed the injection without aggression. The sedative slowly took effect, her body growing heavier until she gently collapsed asleep onto the ground. They lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her into the main treatment building. Juan followed but remained outside when the doors closed behind the veterinarians. He leaned against the wooden wall with his arms crossed, staring at the floor while listening to the sounds inside without seeing anything. A few minutes later, one of the veterinarians opened the door and explained that contractions had already begun and the birth would need to happen immediately. Juan said nothing. He closed his eyes briefly, then looked back down at the ground with the same expression of someone calculating something he didn't want to calculate. The delivery took place inside while Juan watched what he could through the glass window. Hands pressed against the frame, breath fogging the glass. 3 premature cubs were placed beside the mother. Juan counted all 3 without blinking. 2 weren't moving. The third showed weak movement in its paws, but the other 2 remained completely still under the bright lights. The veterinarians immediately rushed toward them. Their thumbs moved in careful, steady rhythm, performing chest compressions on bodies small enough to fit entirely in a single palm. Juan pressed his forehead against the glass. The seconds passed painfully slowly, each one measured by the movement of the veterinarian's thumbs. Then one cub opened its mouth and released a cry one couldn't hear, but could clearly see through the window. The second cub responded shortly afterward. Slower, but alive. Juan remained frozen there with his forehead against the glass and finally closed his eyes. When he opened them again, all 3 cubs were moving beside the sleeping mother, while the veterinarians wore the expression of people who had just accomplished something worthwhile. Juan stepped away from the window and rested his head against the wooden wall of the building, staring at the darkening sky above the forest. One of the veterinarians opened the door and motioned for Juan to come inside. He entered carefully, clothes still damp and steps heavy, approaching the table where the Jaguar lay sedated with slow, regular breathing. The cubs were beside her on a heated surface, tiny paws twitching with the clumsy movements of creatures that still hadn't fully understood how to exist inside their own bodies. The veterinarian lifted one of the cubs and gently placed it into Juan's open palm without speaking. The tiny animal fit entirely there from nose to tail. Its weight felt impossibly light for something that had cost so much to reach this moment. Juan stared at it with an expression that wasn't exactly happiness and wasn't exactly relief, but something made from both. He lowered himself slightly and carefully brought the cub near the Jaguar's muzzle. Slowly, without sudden movement, allowing scent to arrive before touch. The Jaguar was sedated but not unconscious. And when the cub came close enough, she slowly opened her eyes. She stared weakly for several seconds without focusing, then instinctively passed her tongue across the cub in a slow motion. Maternal instinct functioning before anything else. Juan said nothing. He remained there for a moment with his hand extended while the mother cleaned her cub and the other 2 squirmed nearby. Then the veterinarian gently took the cub back. Juan stood, took a small step backward, crossed his arms, and watched the scene from farther away like someone who understands when it's time to step out of the center of something. The veterinarians treated the Jaguar with the calm efficiency of people who had done this for years. The towel bandage was replaced with proper surgical dressings. The wound was cleaned and sealed. Her vitals were monitored as the sedative slowly wore off. Juan remained quiet in the corner of the room, answering questions about what had happened in the jungle, but never elaborating more than necessary. When the veterinarians finished with the Jaguar and turned toward him, he realized from the way they looked at his leg that it was finally time to deal with the injury he had deliberately ignored since the puma attack. The wound was inflamed, hot to the touch, hurting far worse than he had admitted during the journey. A deep, constant pain, the kind you learn to push aside when there's no alternative. They carefully cleaned the bite, wrapped it properly, and gave him antibiotics while explaining what he needed to do over the coming days. Juan listened, nodded that he understood, and asked whether he could stay the night at the sanctuary. The veterinarians said it was the least they could offer. One went to prepare food while the other got a simple wooden room ready for him. Juan ate for the first time in hours, sitting silently at a small table in the sanctuary with the kind of hunger that only appears once danger has truly passed. Afterward, he went to the room, opened the laptop from his backpack, and connected the camera to transfer the footage from the day. As the files copied, he sat staring at the progress bar without thinking about anything specific. When the transfer finished, he opened one of the clips and silently watched fragments of the mountain climb with the Jaguar on his back. The camera shook with every step. His breathing filled the audio. The dense jungle passed on both sides. The footage was raw and imperfect, and it was exactly what the documentary needed to be. He closed the laptop without watching everything, turned off the light, and lay flat on his back in the darkness, listening to the jungle outside. The endless combination of insects, wind, and running water that never stops no matter what happens inside it. His leg throbbed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, and he let exhaustion slowly replace every thought one by one until none remained. Juan spent the next 3 days at home without entering the jungle, which for him felt like a form of involuntary withdrawal. He cleaned his equipment, organized the raw footage on his computer, treated his leg according to the veterinarian's instructions, and paced around the apartment with the restless energy of someone used to constant movement. The photographs on the walls watched him the entire time. On the third day, his phone vibrated on the table while he edited footage. It was a message from one of the sanctuary veterinarians with a photo attached. Juan opened the image and stared at it for a long time without doing anything else. The computer cursor blinked forgotten beside him. In the photo, the Jaguar stood in an open patch of vegetation with all 3 cubs around her. According to the message, all of them were healthy and stable. The wound had healed well. The cubs were feeding normally, and that morning they had been released back into the wild. Into the very same region where Juan had first found the Jaguar hanging from the cliff with a deadly fall below her. Juan looked at the photo a little longer. Then he turned the phone face down on the table and opened the closet where he kept his backpack. It wasn't a deeply considered decision. It was simply the next obvious thing to do. He began organizing supplies with the automatic movements of someone who had repeated the process hundreds of times. Every item in its place. Every pocket containing exactly what it needed. He entered through the same trail as before with the camera hanging from his neck and the backpack fitted comfortably against his shoulders. The jungle was unchanged, humid, dense, and overflowing with layered sounds. Juan filmed while walking, capturing beams of sunlight through the canopy and tiny details on the forest floor most people never notice. He passed the stream where he had washed his hands 3 days earlier and stopped briefly to film the water. Then continued. He passed the apple tree and the rock where the Jaguar had collapsed after the fight with the puma. Filming each location like someone mapping an event that needed documenting before the jungle erased all traces of it. He was filming a denser section of vegetation when he heard rustling to his right. He stopped instantly with the camera still aimed forward and his entire body perfectly still, recognizing the very specific sound of movement in leaves that isn't caused by wind. He remained there breathing slowly, waiting, expecting nothing. The Jaguar emerged from between the trees with the silent presence large predators possess when they aren't in a hurry, stepping from shadow into filtered light as though built specifically for that environment. Juan slowly lowered the camera without stopping the recording. The two stared at one another in silence for a long moment while the entire jungle seemed to hold its breath around them. Then the leaves moved again. One by one, the 3 cubs emerged from the vegetation, stumbling over each other with the awkward movements of animals still learning coordination. Bigger now than they had been 3 days earlier. They sniffed the ground around their mother, looked at Juan with curiosity but no fear. One cub even walked a few steps toward him before stopping, sniffing the air, and returning to the Jaguar as though it had confirmed whatever it needed to confirm. Juan slowly lowered himself to his knees and carefully raised the camera to film the scene without frightening anyone. The Jaguar watched him for several more seconds with the same calm attentiveness, he now recognized well. Then she turned and walked back into the jungle with slow, confident steps, the healed wound visible on her side, the cubs running behind her. One by one they disappeared between the trees until the jungle swallowed all four completely. Juan remained kneeling there listening to their footsteps fade away until no sound remained except the ones that had always been there. Then he turned off the camera, hung the strap around his neck, and began walking back home. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the Ruta Narrata channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories filled with emotion, mystery, and surprises. Your support makes all the difference.